All right, take three. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, if you grew up listening to alternative rock in the 90s, you've possibly heard the Vaselines, even if you don't realize it. Their songs showed up on Nirvana covers, including their MTV Unplugged performance, and maybe some compilation albums passed around between friends, like maybe on a mixtape or something. But the band themselves, they were never that big. In fact, they barely existed, really. And that's what makes their story sort of interesting. So, yes, the Vaselines were a scrappy indie band from Glasgow, Scotland, who lasted just a couple of years, and they released a handful of records and somehow left a permanent mark on alternative music. So, the Vaselines, their story isn't really that complicated. They formed in 1986 in Glasgow, and the band was made up of Eugene Kelly and Francis McKee, just two people with a minimal setup and very little interest in sounding particularly polished. The music was lo fi and raw, and you can hear a little bit of punk rock in it, but also the indie pop and folk music vibes. The songs were simple, straightforward, catchy melodies, basic chord progressions, and lyrics that didn't take themselves too seriously. There was humor in their music. Sometimes it was sweet, and sometimes crude, and sometimes both at the same time. They weren't trying to be clever in some grand way. They just wrote songs that felt honest and slightly unhinged. So their first release came out in 1987, an EP called Son of a Gun, and that EP included the title track Son of a Gun, which would later become one of their most well-known songs because yes, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana decided to cover that one. And a year later they followed that up with another EP, Dying for It, which included Molly's Lips, another song that Nirvana decided to cover. And those two songs alone would end up doing more for the band's legacy than they probably imagined. In 1989, the Vaselines released their first and only full length album from that era. It was called Dum Dum. The album included songs like Sex Sucks and Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam. The latter is especially important, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Not long after Dum Dum came out, the band broke up. That was basically it. I think they've had a few reunions or something like that, but they pretty much didn't do much after that. About 2.5 years together, two EPs and one album. No big tours or mainstream success, really, and no real audience outside of a small independent music scene. By all normal standards, the Vaselines should have just disappeared. But Kurt Cobain happened. And that's where the story changes because Kurt Cobain was a massive fan of the Vaselines. He talked about them constantly in interviews. He put their songs on his personal top lists, and he played their records over and over. Nirvana, like I said, ended up covering some Vaseline songs, three to be exact. There was Molly's Lips, Son of a Gun, and you guessed it, Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam. Although Kurt changed the title into Jesus Doesn't Want Me for a Sunbeam, so he kind of put his own spin on it. And that was, something that Nirvana made famous by performing it during the MTV Unplugged session. And Cobain didn't just cover their songs, he treated the Vaselines like a missing link in alternative rock history. And he made people curious about them. The legend of the band grew. So it really made their story seem more complex than it probably was. And Eugene Kelly once said that without Nirvana, the Vaselines would probably be completely forgotten. Not even a one hit wonder, just a no hit wonder. And Cobain's admiration turned the tiny band into a cult favorite, especially in the US. Fans digging deeper into Nirvana's influences kept running into the same name, the Vaselines. And after splitting up in 1989, Kelly and McKee went their separate ways musically. There was no big plan to reunite, And for years, the Vaselines existed mostly as a footnote in alternative rock liner notes. But the interest never fully went away. So they did have at least one reunion, and that was in 2008, nearly 20 years after they broke up. And they started playing live again, reconnecting with an audience that had grown without them. So, in other news, in 2010, they released Sex with an X, which was actually their first album in over 2 decades. So I guess I kind of lied to you. They actually did have something else come out. And it was surprisingly well received. It didn't sound like a band trying to modernize or chase relevance. It sounded like the Vaselines picking up where they had left off. They followed it up with in 2014 with V for Vaselines. That album got back into their straightforward melodic style with simple songs, strong hooks, and no overthinking. You've got tracks like One Lost Year, where they showed they still understood what made their music work in the first place. So the Vaselines never became a mainstream band, they never filled arenas, and they never had a radio hit in the traditional sense. But their influence still runs deep, especially for a band that didn't really try that hard, you know. And their music is remembered for its simplicity and charm and some emotional honesty. And they could be funny and sincere at the same time, which isn't necessarily easy to pull off. Maybe they weren't trying to pull it off, you know, they were just that way. And indie bands across generations have cited them as an influence, not because they were flashy or technically impressive, but because they sounded real, like people making music because they wanted to, not because they had a plan or they were catering to a genre or any sort of elitist interests or whatever. They just wanted to make music and do their own thing, from the sounds of it anyway. And they also represent something rare in music history, proof that you don't need a long career or a massive catalog to matter. And sometimes, you know, it's nice to know that a few songs are enough and that you can have a little bit of a splash, even if you don't have the hugest impact. You can still be worth remembering. So the Vaselines are one of those bands that remind you how strange music history can be. A short lived group from Glasgow, ignored at the time, but rescued by the love of another artist and eventually recognized for what they were all along. They're a band that seemingly shouldn't have lasted, given all the odds against success that exist, even for some good bands who work their tail feathers off. And somehow, the band's impact still seems to be stable with minimal fuss. It's a potential source of jealousy, but also respect. You know, I think that's cool that sometimes you just you just have the right stuff and you're successful even without necessarily trying that hard. It's just you've had some bit of luck, and of course, what the skill, and somebody out there likes you and puts your name out there enough that people start to take notice of it. And I guess that's what things like college radio are about as well. And that's why I'm happy to be a college radio DJ myself. So maybe sometimes I can help bring certain artists to a listener's ear. And I know that I've in fact done that on a few occasions. So I guess I'm kind of tooting my own horn here. I said whore, my own horn a little bit here. Um, but you know that's one reason to consider getting into things like that, like be a college radio DJ or something like that. You know, whatever it takes to like uh, create a lasting impression in people. You know, get your own music out there somehow. Help others spread the word about their musical projects or whatever sort of projects, and that can be a way for you to actually help an artist thrive. And in a time where artists struggle, which is most of the time, well, they might appreciate it. Um, anyway, that's it for this episode. I'm starting to meander off. Um, but anyway, Have a good one.